Friday, a Victory Friday. Good morning. Hope your weekend's off to a great start. Thanks for joining us on KCMO. Maybe a little groggy if you were at the game last night like I was, but you're hanging in there, you're getting ready for the weekend, and the Friday is that much sweeter after a win, even if it's a win by just a couple of inches along that back line. So the Kansas City Star wrote a piece this morning, and they referenced this show. They write here, headline by David Mastio, an opinion piece in the Kansas City Star, Tucker Carlson defending Hitler, Kremlin propaganda, conservative media in crisis. And, Tucker Carlson's coming to T-Mobile next week. He's going to be here. Of course, we've got a pair of tickets for you at 8:45 this morning, as we've been giving away all week long. And now the Kansas City Star, of course, is going after him ahead of his show next week in this town. They write here, this week it became clear that the sickness among Republicans and conservatives who have been enthralled by Donald Trump is not going to end when he loses the presidential election. Oh, that's a bold statement. What does this guy know that we don't? By the way, the odds makers are putting Trump in the driver's seat, but I guess that's neither here nor there. Star writes, this disease will continue its course. Indeed, it is possible things will get worse. This week, Tucker Carlson, a man who had a primetime speaking slot at the Republican convention where he sat next to Trump, invited Nazi sympathizer Daryl Cooper onto his streaming show and into the lives of millions of his fans to rehabilitate Adolf Hitler as a spurned peacemaker who was pushed into Jewish genocide by a warmongering Winston Churchill. This is insane. Next week, Carlson bringing his fascist show to T-Mobile Center in Kansas City, with some people paying more than $100 to get close. The next day, Carlson will be speaking before 1,000 more in Wichita at Intrust Bank Arena. I don't think this is what T-Mobile and Intrust had in mind when they paid for the naming rights to those venues. They add here, Carlson is no fringe figure. As a Fox News commentator, he had an audience of millions 5 nights a week. His work has been shared by billionaire ex-social network owner Elon Musk. Mastio goes on the right in the Kansas City Star. Similarly, the guests who will be sharing the stage for his 2 shows, Megyn Kelly, a defrocked journalist, and Charlie Kirk, head of conservative group Turning Point USA, have millions of their own followers. Locally, Pete Mundo of KCMO has interviewed Carlson on his show. Right now, it is unclear if this descent into shilling for a long-dead dictator responsible for the deaths of more than 50 million people is enough to get Kelly, Kirk, and Mundo to back away, writes the Kansas City Star. Well, I will answer the question here, and the answer is no, because I don't accept your false premise. And that's exactly what this is. Now, I don't know Daryl Cooper, this person that Carlson interviewed on his podcast. I don't know anything about the guy, but heck, we just spent 10 minutes interviewing a guy last hour who is an Israeli resident who I met last night through my buddy David Block at the Chiefs game, who is involved in the Israeli government to some degree. And if you don't know where I stand when it comes to defending Israel, then that's okay. It just means you haven't been around the show long enough. There's not been a more staunch supporter of Israel in this media market than this show. And frankly, I don't think it's all that close. So you know where I stand. And while I have no idea what was in this Carlson interview, I'm certainly not going to accept the premise of the Kansas City Star because I don't trust them as far as I can throw them. So I'm not going to take their word for it that it was a bunch of Nazi propaganda before I listen to it myself. But it's interesting how if you interview somebody, right, and that's what I did. I've interviewed Tucker Carlson. I've had him on this show to talk about his show coming to KC next week. I plan to be there. I think we're kind of on the fence. It's always about the babysitters these days. That's how it goes. But regardless of any of that, why does that make me somebody who must then approve of every interview somebody else does. If I interview someone and then they go interview somebody else who I may not agree with, why is that an indictment on me? What does that have to do with me? And by the way, I don't know how Tucker feels about any of this. Once again, I'm taking the Kansas City Star's words here on an interview that I have not listened to. And if there's one thing we should all agree on here, it is not taking the Kansas City Star at its word, first and foremost. But secondarily to all of that, I find it fascinating that the Kansas City Star has taken a stronger stance on Tucker Carlson talking to somebody on a podcast than they have the thugs and the punks at UMKC and at KU who are sympathizing with Hamas. It'd be nice if they had these kind of stones to call out people who are sympathizing with those who committed the most heinous attacks against the Jewish people since the Nazis. Instead, they'd rather rail on Tucker Carlson for having somebody on his podcast. Well, in the meantime, you have protests happening on the plaza over the last bunch of months at UMKC. They have shown sympathy with different groups on campus. They had that little dopey sit-in at KU there back in the spring. They did all those different things. And you didn't see a peep from the Star condemning this to this level, like Tucker Carlson. And then what else do they do in this piece that is always, always, always part of their grand plan? Try to get it canceled. And they're not going to get it canceled. But notice how they bring up here, or Mastio brings up here in this piece in the Star. He writes, I don't think this is what T-Mobile and Intrust had in mind when they paid for the naming rights to the venues here in Kansas City and in Wichita. Oh, see? They're going for the cancel culture. That's the next card to play here. Well, T-Mobile, you don't want to be associated with Tucker Carlson now, do you, in Kansas City? They're not going to do it by next Thursday, but it's laying the foundation for stuff like this in the future. That's what it's in large part about as well. Because when they don't get their way, what do? They cancel. They try to intimidate sponsors, whether it's corporately or locally. They will try to intimidate the people involved. They will try to shame the people involved. Instead of trying to win based on substance, instead of trying to be, persuadable in your arguments, they don't do that. They just call you a Nazi. Despite the fact that today, yes, there's absolutely, I will readily admit, a faction of the far, far right that is anti-Israel, that is pro-Hamas, that is Nazi-like in their beliefs. That's very much true. There's an element of that on the far right. I don't deny that for a second. But you tell me, where is it more mainstream right now? Who are the members of Congress, by the way? The members of the squad who have been screaming all over Washington, D.C. about ceasefire now, Israel's in the wrong, you're committing war crimes. The members of Congress, like the people with actual power in this country, political power in this country, who have been of that opinion, are Democrats. Whether it's Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, you know the list. The Beatles wannabe. We had one in Missouri with Cori Bush. She was kind of like the George Harrison, and now she's gone, or will be gone before long. That's where it's far more mainstream. So I'm willing to admit there's an element of it, for sure, on the far right. Absolutely. It's completely ludicrous, full of wackos from that perspective. But where is that power actually at in the political landscape? The power to be anti-Israel is far more likely and relevant within the Democratic Party in D.C. than it is the Republican Party. And when the Kansas City Star starts calling that out, then maybe you can start criticizing myself and Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson.